If I were diagnosed with a terminal disease, the world wouldn't end in one loud moment. It would grow quiet. There would be a pause between the doctor's words and my breath, a stillness where everything familiar suddenly feels far away. In hospice, I've learned that this silence is often where the truth begins, not fear, not drama, just a deep awareness that life is fragile and time is precious. People imagine the hardest part is pain or sadness, but often it's the quiet realization that nothing needs to be rushed anymore, that some conversations matter more than answers, that being present is more powerful than being strong. At the end of life, I've watched people stop pretending. They let go of who they thought they had to be and rest in who they are. Love becomes simpler, regrets become softer, and moments, small, ordinary moments, start to feel sacred. Like, story isn't about dying. It's about what becomes clear when time feels limited, and how sometimes that clarity brings a strange and gentle peace. If I were diagnosed with a terminal disease, the first thing that would change wouldn't be my body. It would be time. Time would no longer feel like something waiting for me in the future. It would sit beside me on the edge of the bed, in the quiet of the room, in the space between one breath and the next. In hospice, I've seen how diagnosis doesn't always arrive with tears or panic. Sometimes it arrives with stillness, a long pause where the mind hasn't caught up, but the heart already knows something important has shifted. People often say, I didn't hear anything after the doctor said the words. Not because they weren't listening, but because the noise inside them went silent. If it were me, I imagine I'd nod politely. I'd ask a practical question, maybe about medications or timelines, not because I'm brave, but because habit takes over before emotion does. And later, alone, I'd notice how the world sounds different. Cars passing, a clock ticking, my own breathing suddenly louder than before. A terminal diagnosis doesn't immediately make you think about death. It makes you think about living, not in big dramatic ways, but in small, almost embarrassing details. Did I waste too much time worrying? Why did I rush through so many meals? Why did I think there would always be another chance to say what mattered? In hospice rooms, I've learned that people rarely talk about achievements at first. They talk about ordinary things, the smell of their kitchen in the morning, the way sunlight used to fall across the floor, a song that reminds them of being young and not knowing they were young. If I were diagnosed, I think I'd start noticing the weight of moments, not the big milestones, but the soft ones. The way a hand feels when it's held a little longer than usual. The way someone looks at you when they're trying not to show fear. The silence after "are you okay?" when everyone knows the answer isn't simple. People assume the hardest part is the fear of dying, but often it's the fear of being forgotten while still alive, of becoming a diagnosis instead of a person. In hospice, I watch patients correct us gently. I'm still me, they say without saying it. They want to be asked how they feel today, not how the disease is progressing. If it were me, I'd want someone to sit down, not stand in the doorway with one hand on the chart, just sit. Presence has a weight to it. You can feel when someone is truly there, and you can feel when they're already thinking about what comes next. A terminal illness strips away urgency for things that never mattered. Deadlines soften, arguments lose their sharp edges. The need to prove anything slowly fades. In its place, something quieter grows. Attention. I've seen people stop apologizing for resting. They stop explaining themselves. They give themselves permission to be tired, to be silent, to be human. And in that permission, something honest appears. If I were diagnosed, I imagine I'd start telling the truth more often. Not dramatic confessions, just gentle truths. I don't feel like talking today. I'm scared. I love you. Words that used to feel heavy suddenly feel necessary. In hospice, I've watched families struggle with silence. They want to fill it with plans, positivity, encouragement. But silence isn't empty at the end of life. It's full. Full of unspoken understanding, shared memory, shared fear. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let it exist. There's a moment many patients describe, usually late at night when the house is quiet. That's when the weight of the diagnosis settles in. Not as panic, but as awareness. Life is finite. And strangely, that awareness doesn't always feel cruel. Sometimes it feels clarifying. If it were me, I think I'd start sorting my life differently. Not my belongings, but my attention. Who gets my energy? What deserves my worry? What can be released without guilt? Be people at the end of life often forgive without ceremonies. They don't always call it forgiveness. They just stop carrying certain stories. The body is already working hard. The heart doesn't want extra weight. I've heard patients say, I wish I had known earlier what I know now, not about death, but about living gently, about not postponing joy, about not waiting for permission to rest. If I were diagnosed, I don't think I'd suddenly become wise. I'd still have moments of anger, moments of denial, moments of denial, moments of denial, moments where I'd forget and make plans that assume too much time, and that would be okay. Hospice has taught me that acceptance isn't a straight line. It moves back and forth like breathing. The body changes first. Energy comes and goes. Food tastes different. Sleep becomes unpredictable. And with each change, there's a small grieving, not loud, just quiet acknowledgments. This is different now. In hospice rooms, I've seen people mourn the version of themselves they used to be, the strong one, the reliable one, the caretaker. Letting go of that identity can be harder than letting go of life itself. If it were me, I'd probably apologize too much at first for needing help, for canceling plans, for not being who I used to be, and I'd need someone to remind me that needing care is not a failure. It's a season. Terminal illness has a way of equalizing everyone. Titles disappear. Status fades. What's left is vulnerability, and vulnerability, when met with kindness, becomes connection. I've watched families learn how to love differently. They slow their voices. They listen with their whole bodies. They stop multitasking during conversations. Time together becomes intentional, even when it's quiet. If I were diagnosed, I think I'd become more sensitive to tone, to how words land, to how people say my name. At the end of life, how something is said often matters more than what is said. People often ask patients, are you at peace? It's a heavy question. Peace isn't constant. It comes in moments, in a good day, in a haired laugh, in a pain-free afternoon. In hospice, I've learned that peace doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means fear doesn't get to speak all the time. If it were me, I'd want honesty without cruelty. Hope without pressure. I'd want someone to say, I'm here, and mean it without trying to fix anything. As time narrows, gratitude often widens, not forced gratitude, not inspirational quotes, but quiet noticing, the way air feels in the lungs, the comfort of familiar voices, the relief of being understood without explanation. People nearing the end of life often stop asking why, not because they found answers, but because the question no longer helps. What matters becomes who and how. Who will sit with me? How will we spend today? If I were diagnosed, I think I'd learn how to receive compliments, care, love. Receiving can be harder than giving, especially for those who've spent their lives being strong. Hospice has taught me that dying people are not giving up. They are conserving energy for what matters, for presence, for connection. For meaning, there's a tenderness that appears near the end of life. Voices soften, touch becomes intentional. Even difficult conversations are spoken carefully, like handling something fragile. If it were me, I'd want my days to be simple, not empty, but uncluttered, less noise, more truth. I've watched patients let go of expectations placed on them long ago. Be productive, be cheerful, be resilient. At the end, just being is enough. Terminal illness doesn't make every moment beautiful. There is discomfort. There is frustration. There are days when hope feels thin, but there is also honesty, and honesty has its own quiet dignity. If I were diagnosed, I think I'd finally understand something I've seen so many times, that life isn't measured in years or milestones, but in moments of genuine presence. Moments when you are fully where you are, with who you are with, without pretending there is somewhere else you need to be. In hospice rooms, the most meaningful conversations often happen without many words. A look, a squeeze of the hand, shared silence, and if this were my diagnosis, my terminal disease, my limited time, I imagine I would begin to live less in the future and more in the now, learning slowly that even when time is short, it can still be deep, still be real, still be enough to hold everything that truly matters, even as the days move differently. The body grows quieter and attention settles into the small, sacred spaces between breaths, between words, between moments where nothing needs to be explained. IG'd or made better, only witnessed and gently held as life continues to unfold in its own unhurried way, asking only that I stay present with it as long as I can, noticing how love sounds softer here, how fear loses some of its edge when shared, and how even now, in this place I never imagined I would be, There is still room for truth, for connection, for being exactly as I am without needing to become anything else, just allowing the days to arrive and leave as they will, one quiet moment at a time without rushing toward meaning or closure, simply staying with what is here, what remains, what still feels real, as the understanding grows, not in words, but in lived experience, that this life, even now, even here, continues to speak in whispers that ask to be listened to rather than answered. And I find myself listening more closely than I ever did before, aware that every sound, every pause, every shared silence carries something worth noticing, something worth staying for, something that does not need to end in certainty, only in presence. As the moment continues to open into the next, gently, without insistence, without conclusion, presence matters more than answers at the end of life. When time becomes uncertain, questions start to lose their urgency. People think the end of life is filled with big questions: why this happened, what comes next, how much time is left. But in hospice, I've seen that most of those questions soften on their own. What remains isn't a need for explanations, it's a need for someone to stay. If I were diagnosed with a terminal disease, I don't think I would need anyone to explain life to me. I wouldn't need perfect words or spiritual certainty. I would need someone who isn't afraid of the quiet. Someone who doesn't rush to fill space with reassurance. Someone who can sit beside me without treating the moment like a problem to solve. Presence is different from help. Help tries to fix, presence stays. In hospice rooms, the people who bring the most comfort are rarely the ones with the best advice. They are the ones who slow down their bodies. They pull up a chair, they put their phone away, they let the room set the pace. If it were me, I imagine I'd become sensitive to who can actually be present. Some people mean well but can't tolerate stillness. They talk quickly, suggest solutions, change the subject when emotions surface. Others say very little, but their silence feels steady, like a hand resting gently on your back. At the end of life, being witnessed matters more than being understood. You don't need someone to fully grasp what you're feeling. You need someone to accept that what you're feeling is real. I've seen patients stop answering questions they're tired of. How are you feeling? What do you need? Sometimes they don't know. Sometimes the question itself feels like work. Presence doesn't demand answers. It allows uncertainty to exist without pressure. If I were diagnosed, I think I'd grow tired of being brave for other people, of reassuring them, of managing their fear. Presence means not asking someone to perform their illness in a way that makes others more comfortable. In hospice, we learn to read the room. Sometimes presence looks like conversation. Sometimes it looks like shared silence. Sometimes it's just breathing together, aware of each other without speaking. There's a difference between loneliness and aloneness.
Many patients are not afraid of being alone.
They are afraid of being left emotionally while people are physically present. Presence bridges that gap. If it were me, I'd want someone who doesn't disappear when things get uncomfortable, when emotions repeat, when fear comes back after it's already been talked about. The end of life is cyclical. Feelings don't resolve neatly. People often think they need to say something meaningful, but meaning is already there. In the act of staying and choosing not to look away, I've watched patients relax when they realize they don't have to explain themselves anymore. Their sighs get deeper, their bodies soften, they stop editing their words. Presence creates safety. If I were diagnosed, I'd notice how presence changes time. Minutes stretch, moments deepen. A simple interaction can feel complete without going anywhere. In hospice, families sometimes ask, what should I say? The answer is often nothing special. Say what's true, or say nothing at all. Just be there. Presence doesn't mean pretending everything is okay. It means allowing things to be exactly as they are. Fear, sadness, peace, gratitude, they can gnawing coexist without explanation. I've seen people reach the end of life without resolving every relationship. Not every conversation gets closure, but presence allows love to exist even without resolution. If it were me, I wouldn't need reassurance that everything happens for a reason. I'd need reassurance that I'm not facing this moment alone. There is a particular kind of listening that happens near the end of life. It's slower, more patient, less focused on responding, more focused on receiving. In hospice rooms, presence often shows up through touch. A hand held, a blanket adjusted, a forehead brushed gently. Touch becomes a language when words feel heavy. If I were diagnosed, I think I'd become more aware of emotional honesty, of people who can say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here. That kind of honesty builds trust. Presence also means allowing someone to change. One day they may want company. The next day they may want quiet. The next day, they may want quiet. Presence adapts without taking it personally. I've watched patients withdraw not because they are giving up, but because their inner world is becoming louder. Presence respects that inward turning without demanding engagement. If it were me, I'd want someone who understands that silence isn't absence. It's often where the most important things are felt. In hospice, we learn that suffering increases when people feel unseen. Even physical pain feels heavier when someone feels alone in it. Presence doesn't remove pain, but it shares the weight. People near the end of life often repeat stories, not because they forget they've told them, but because the memory still matters. Presence listens again without impatience. If I were diagnosed, I'd want my fears to be allowed to exist without being argued with. Presence doesn't try to talk fear away. It sits beside it. There's a humility in presence. It accepts that you cannot fix what is happening, that your role is not to rescue, but to accompany. In hospice, I've seen how powerful it is when someone stays even when there is nothing left to do. When care becomes less about action and more about attention. If it were me, I think I'd finally understand why people remember who showed up, not who had the best advice. Years later, families talk about the ones who sat quietly, who stayed late, who didn't rush the goodbye. Presence allows grief to unfold naturally. It doesn't push it away or demand strength. It gives grief space to breathe. I've seen patients relax when they realize they don't have to protect others from their truth. Presence gives permission to be real. If I were diagnosed, I'd want my remaining time to be shared with people who can tolerate vulnerability, who don't change the subject when things get heavy, who understand that being present is an active choice. In hospice, presence often looks like waiting for someone to speak, waiting for sleep to come, waiting for pain to ease, waiting without impatience. There is something deeply human about being present with someone at the end of life. It strips away performance. It reveals what matters most. If it were me, I'd learn that presence is not about doing more. It's about doing less, but with intention. As life slows, presence becomes the language through which love is expressed, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. I've watched people who are busy their entire lives finally sit still, and in that stillness, connection deepens. Presence doesn't require certainty about what comes next. It only asks that we stay with what is here now. If I were diagnosed, I think I'd begin to see presence as a form of respect. Respect for the moment, for the person, for the truth of what is happening. In hospice rooms, the most peaceful moments often come when no one is trying to make sense of anything. When the room is allowed to be quiet, when everyone is simply there. Presence teaches us that love doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be steady. If this were my terminal diagnosis, my limited time, I imagine I would stop searching for answers that promise comfort and instead lean into the comfort of shared space, shared breath, shared silence. Learning that presence does not erase fear, but softens it, does not solve grief, but makes it bearable, does not give certainty, but offers connection. And in that connection, there is something grounding, something human, something that allows each moment to stand on its own without needing to point toward a future or explain itself. As I remain here with those who choose to stay, noticing how much can be said without words, how much can be felt without being named. Now presence itself becomes a quiet thread that holds everything together as time continues to move in its own way, unforced, unhurried, carrying us from one moment into the next without asking for conclusions, only attention. Letting go happens in layers, not all at once. If I were diagnosed with a terminal disease, I don't think I would immediately let go of life. I would let go of things slowly, often without realizing it. Not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet adjustments that happen almost unnoticed. In hospice, I've seen how letting go rarely looks like surrender. It looks like softening, like loosening a grip that's been held too tightly for too long. At first, people try to hold on to everything the same way. Their routines, their roles, their expectations of themselves. They tell themselves, I'm still the same person. And they are, but something underneath begins to change. If it were me, I imagine I'd start by letting go of the idea that I can control how this unfolds. Control is usually the first thing to feel heavy. Schedules stop making sense. Plans become tentative. The future no longer feels like a place you're moving toward, but a fog you're standing inside. I've watched patients struggle with this quietly. They don't always say it out loud, but you can see it in their eyes the moment they realize effort doesn't guarantee outcomes anymore, that the body has its own timeline. Letting go doesn't mean not caring. It means caring differently. If I were diagnosed, I think I'd start letting go of the pressure to be useful, to contribute, to stay productive. Hospice teaches you that worth is not tied to output. A person resting is still a person living. I've seen people apologize for sleeping too much, for needing help, for not being who they used to be. Letting go begins when those apologies slow down. There is grief in letting go of strength, of independence, of the version of yourself that didn't need reminders or assistance. This grief is quiet, but it's real. If it were me, I'd probably resist this at first. I'd push myself on good days. I'd overestimate what I can do. And then I'd pay for it with exhaustion. Eventually, I'd learn that listening to the body is not giving up, it's adapting. In hospice rooms, I've noticed how people start releasing old identities, the fixer, the caretaker. Roles that once defined them begin to feel too heavy to carry. Letting go of a role can feel like disappearing. But what often emerges is something more honest. If I were diagnosed, I think I'd start letting go of long-held resentments, not because someone asked me to, but because they take too much energy. Holding on to anger requires a future where it matters. At the end of life, energy becomes precious. I've seen patients say it's not worth it anymore about arguments that once consumed them. They don't always call it forgiveness. They just stop revisiting the story. Letting go also means allowing relationships to change. Some people step closer, some step back. Not everyone can walk this path with you. If it were me, I'd feel that loss deeply. Not just the illness, but the quiet distance that appears in certain relationships. People don't leave because they don't care. They leave because they don't know how to stay. In hospice, we talk about anticipatory grief, grief that arrives before loss fully happens. Patients grieve their own absence. Their family grieves quietly alongside them. Letting go includes allowing others to grieve in their own way, even when it hurts. If I were diagnosed, I think I'd let go of the need to be understood by everyone. Some people will never fully grasp what this feels like, and that's okay. Understanding becomes less important than authenticity. I've seen patients stop explaining themselves, stop justifying their choices. They grow comfortable with being misunderstood. Letting go also happens in the body. Appetite changes, energy fades, the body asks for rest more often. There is a grief in every physical change, but there is also relief in no longer fighting them. If it were me, I'd learn to measure days differently, not by how much I did, but by how present I felt, by moments of comfort, by moments of connection. In hospice, time feels different, days stretch and contract. What once felt urgent fades. What once felt small becomes meaningful. Letting go means allowing moments to be enough on their own. I've seen people let go of long-term plans, trips they won't take, events they won't take, events they won't attend. This letting go is tender. It deserves gentleness. If it were me, I'd need space to grieve these losses without being told, to stay positive. Positivity can sometimes interrupt grief before it's finished speaking. Letting go also means releasing the need for certainty. Not knowing how much time remains, not knowing what the next week will bring. In hospice, uncertainty becomes part of daily life, and eventually it becomes less frightening. If I were diagnosed, I think I'd stop asking, how long do I have? Not because I wouldn't care, but because the answer would start to matter less than how I use today. I've watched patients focus inward as time goes on. Their world grows smaller but deeper. They notice details they once overlooked. Letting go includes trusting others with your care, allowing yourself to be helped. This can feel like a loss of dignity at first, but dignity is not independence. Dignity is being treated with respect. If it were me, I'd struggle with this. I'd want to do things myself. And then I'd want to do things myself. And then I'd learn that receiving care can be an act of love, not weakness. I've seen families learn this too. They shift from fixing to accompanying, from doing to being. Letting go also means releasing the idea that everything must be resolved. Some questions remain unanswered. Some relationships stay complicated. In hospice, I've learned that peace doesn't require completion. It requires acceptance. If I were diagnosed, I think I'd let go of the idea that life needs a neat ending, that everything must be wrapped up with meaning and clarity. Sometimes life just continues quietly until it doesn't. Letting go happens in the pauses, in the moments when words don't come, in the times when the body asks for rest instead of conversation. I've seen patients who stop reaching for distractions. They turn inward, not in sadness, but in reflection. If it were me, I'd probably find comfort in repetition. Familiar voices, familiar music, familiar routines. Letting go doesn't mean detaching from life, it means holding it more gently. As time narrows, expectations loosen, the need to perform fades. The need to explain disappears. I've watched people become more themselves near the end of life, not less. Stripped of roles, stripped of urgency, stripped of obligation. If this were my diagnosis, my terminal disease, my limited time, I imagine letting go would continue quietly, layer by layer, expectation by expectation, story by story, not all at once and not in a straight line, but gradually through small choices and subtle shifts as I learn to release what no longer fits, what no longer serves, what requires more effort than it offers comfort. Allowing myself to rest more deeply into the present moment, into the care being offered, into the reality of what is unfolding, trusting that letting go is not losing myself, but returning to something simpler, something truer, something that does not need to be rushed or resolved, only acknowledged as it arrives, moment by moment, breath by breath, without demanding certainty or closure as life continues to move softly forward, asking only for my attention, my honesty, my willingness to stay with what is here, even as more falls away, even as the shape of my days changes, even as I learn that letting go is not the end of connection, but a different way of holding what remains.